Um, and then I'll go back and do the introduction. The introduction at the top of your handout more has to do with 12 than 11, but we still need to finish 11. And in between, chapter 5 through 8, and then the section chapter 12 through 16 really connect to each other. And then in chapter 9 through 11, like we've been talking about, Paul needed to stop and just clarify some things about the Jews and the Gentiles and coming together in a way and having people really change the way they think. And having people really change the way that they look at something that the world just, this is how it is. This is what it is. People are in different camps. And, people wouldn't have walked around thinking every day, ever since Babel, people have been in these groups and people have been off and they have struggled to get along. They've struggled in their power structures with each other. They've struggled in all these ways. It's just kind of the way it is. And God, Paul says, is bringing everybody back into one family, one human family, and one because everybody's in the same boat with sin, and everybody's in the same boat in need of God, and so that puts everyone together. And it is how he intended to make his creation. He intended to make his creation very diverse and very creative and work and harmonize together. And that's not how the world operates. That's not how we work. And so this is a really change in worldview and thinking. So in 9, 10, and 11, he stops and he says, I know what you're thinking, especially he's been talking to the Jews in 9, 10, and part of 11. This is mainly for the Jews, but we've reached the point in chapter 11 where he says, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles. But he just has to say to the Jews, man, I want you to hear me. I don't want you to hear me say that being chosen by God and failing means that he's done with you. That's not what I'm saying at all. I don't want you to hear that. I want you to hear that through your failure, which is how God works. That's the whole deal of the Bible. It is through failure that God works. That's not how we work, but it is through failure that God works. And that's where you can find him the most, is right there. And so he says in 9 and 10 and 11, it's through your failure that now salvation has come to the world. And if it means we get jealous a little bit, let's get jealous a little bit. And let's want our God, Let's not get mad at other people. Let's want our God, And once again, even his jealousy, so to speak, is being transformed by the Spirit, into, man, I just want my God more. Because he's an amazing God. The more I learn about him and the more I see how much he cares for everything and everybody, I just want him more, is kind of what Paul is saying. So he turns to the Gentiles in verse 13. He says, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles. That's how we know he's speaking to the Gentiles, because he says, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am apostle to the Gentiles, I glorify my ministry in order to make my own people jealous, and thus save some of them. For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. And if the root is holy, then the branches are holy. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in their place to share the rich root of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. If you do boast, remember that it is not you that support the root, but the root that supports you. So one of the things we need to realize is that, what's going on with the Gentile people in a church like Rome, and especially in a church where they've kind of been running things. Remember, the Jews had been told by the Emperor Claudius to leave the city. And so when the church was first planted in Rome, it would have had a Jewish look to it. It would have had people who celebrated the Sabbath. It would have had people who went to the festivals. It would have had people, just like we read about in Acts. And more Gentiles accept the message, and more Gentiles come into the church. And there was probably some of this conflicts going on. But then the Jews were forced to leave the city, right? We all know that. And so the church becomes a Gentile church. Do you think the church practiced Sabbath keeping, kosher food laws, all those kinds of things? No, they didn't practice any of those things. They did whatever they did in those days, worshiping the Messiah in their house churches, So then the Jews come back, likely about 54, about 6 years later. The Jews come back into the city, and this is where we're getting our conflict right now, is the Jews have come back and said, this church doesn't look right. I mean, as Jesus people, we have to be Jewish Jesus people, We have to practice Jewish things. And so remember that when he says, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, he's addressing their reaction to that, right? That's the situation in which he's addressing. He's addressing the fact that they've said, dude, you guys are doing it all wrong. We're God's chosen people. We have the covenant. We have, all the things that Paul has said. And so what's their reaction to that? No. And people in their worst moments probably were saying, you guys used to be the chosen people, but obviously you're not now. Okay? You used to be God's special people, but now we are. That's what they were saying in their worst, most immature spiritual moments and in their human moments, because that's what humans do and say, is they get mad at each other and they do those things. And so Paul is addressing that, their reaction, okay? And he says, let's remember. And what does he say to them? Let's remember how you got here, okay? There's a tree that's been planted. Paul likely has some sort of tree by water, like Psalms 1. There's a tree planted by the water, and it's full and rich and produces fruit and leaves and all those things. And he uses the illustration of an olive tree. And he says, remember, you were grafted into this. You weren't a part of that tree. You weren't a part of so many things that we're saying and that we're coming from. You weren't a part of that. Okay? And he says, but if some of the branches, verse 17, were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in the place to share the rich root, do not boast over the branches. Okay? If you do boast, remember that it is not you that support the root, but the root that supports you. Very common human thing. After we are blessed and after we think we did it. We think we got it. We do that all the time. It was all me. Yeah, it was me. And the whole worldview of Romans is that none of this has anything to do with you. You did none of this. God did all of this. God did all of this. But once again, they're falling into the same, a little bit different trap than the Jews fall into as human thinkers, okay, who need a worldview, reset and rechange. They've got a little different way of doing the same thing. It's us now. Look how special we are. Therefore, if I'm now special, then the other person is not special. I was trying to think and pray about a kind of an illustration, and it's the feeling of what I came up with, and you guys help me and let's talk about it if you can think of other situations. But you kind of see this from time to time in stories and movies and different things, that parents have one child and that's their only child, and then after a few years they have another child. Okay? And what can the first child sometimes think if it's not done correctly? And still, if it's done correctly, they can think this. What? Yeah, they're jealous. Okay? I'm not the special one anymore, okay? Because there's another one, and a parent might say something like, you're both. as much a part of our family. We love you now, but now our family's bigger, and we need your help to bring this new person into the family, You haven't been cast aside. And that's kind of the picture that Paul is painting here, that there's some jealousy that's going on. And Paul says, good, I'm glad. I'm hoping that it causes the Jews to pull in tighter and pull in even more. But verse 19, once again, remember how many times in this letter has he anticipated the Jews' questions? Here is anticipating the Gentile questions, okay, or what the Gentiles might say. Verse 19, you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in, so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stood only through faith, okay? They weren't broken off, in a sense, so that you could be grafted in. Yeah, they were, but they weren't. It wasn't to replace, let's get rid of this branch so we can replace it with that. There was a reason you were grafted, you were torn off. It was because you didn't believe in the Messiah. You didn't believe in Jesus. That's why they were torn off. Okay? And so what do you think he might say to the Gentiles here in the next few verses? If God breaks off branches of people who don't believe, what might he do to the new branches that have been grafted in? If he has a history of breaking off branches that don't believe, he could break your branch off too. Because it wasn't that that the Jews were broken off just because, man, we got too many Jews, we need some Gentiles. That's not why. The only reason a branch is torn off is because it's not getting life from the root. And so what has happened to it? It's withered and died. It serves no purpose but to drag the whole tree down. Okay? That's the point that he's making. He says, for if God did not spare the natural branches, perhaps he will not spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness toward you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you will also be cut off. And even those of Israel, if they do not persist in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you have been cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? Remember, it's an illustration that he's using. It's a picture of something that belongs to the life of something else, It's not a piece of a puzzle that's put in, but this tree is alive, and it's getting life from a source. And some branches are not getting life from the source. His argument is by their own choosing, they're not getting life from their source. So therefore, hey, it can happen to you. You could choose not to get life from the source. And one of the ways that you don't get life from the source is to create your own knowledge of what you're doing here, and your own knowledge of how you got here, and your own knowledge of who those people that are not there, what to think about them. Though that seems to be the problem here that humans can run into, is we create our own knowledge of good and evil, again, as we've talked about before. Questions, comments. What do you think? Happy birthday. Bobby Lynn's birthday is today. Camille, I'm glad you were born too. Just your mom today. Yeah, questions, comments. One of the most important statements here that he said throughout here is, note the kindness and the severity of God. Okay? I believe we live in a culture, in a church culture, that has, and I'm not talking about just here, but I'm just talking about in general, Christianity in America notes the kindness of God more than we note the severity of God. Oh, yeah. Yeah. When you hear the language, everybody's with God. Everybody's there, you know. And yeah, because I mean, it's sometimes it's subtle, and sometimes but if there is a belief in God, then everybody's there, and it's kind of become. You would just never talk about a God that punishes people. And I mean, there's a whole part of our class, which we've done before, and we can do again anytime. I don't think it's punishment, you know. I think it's I mean, was the last phrase I read a couple weeks ago, I mentioned it. Hell is a courtesy to those who choose to disobey. It gives them what they want. It gives them what they've chosen all along. Yeah, sure, you can have that. I will allow that. And it will sure make what I'm doing a whole bunch easier, you know, without all that present. But yeah, Mark. Oh, wow. Incredible. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Oh, exactly. You know, it's so interesting to me. If you just sat down and said, "What's the New Testament about?" and I'm talking about, I guess when I say that is, what are the letters about? The letters are a response to the Gospels. Jesus comes and he introduces this new life and this new way of doing things, and it's, you know, blowing people's brains up, basically. Sometimes I think we lose some of that in the way we read the Gospels and the way we read the parables, and Jesus was really just flipping the way people think around. You know, some of the obvious examples, but he does it over and over again, is, I tell you, pray for your enemy. You know, I tell you, if somebody asked you to go a mile with them, which was a Roman soldier's right, you know, he was using a law from the day, something that happened probably quite a bit, was a Roman soldier just felt like being a jerk today, and somebody looks like they're in a hurry, trying to get somewhere. Hey, come carry my stuff, you know, carry my shield, and, you know, he says, and they were required by Roman law, you can only make them do that 1 mile, you know. And the Romans would prosecute if you made somebody do more than that, you know. And Jesus says, I tell you, go with them 2 miles, you know. And so those are just a couple of obvious examples that come. But Jesus comes and he kind of pops everybody's mind. And then he says, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to give you the Spirit. And now go and do this, live this. And so the New Testament, the letters, are Paul thinking through, how do we do this? You know, how do we live this new life? It's a new world. It's a brand new world. We're brand new people. You know, how do we live this? And we're running into situation after situation as humans live and as humans work. And What comes out of the letters more than anything else, by far the majority, the big majority, is how to get along with other people. And how to get along with people that are different from you. That's what comes out, because that's the problem that we face in the world, you know. How do we do this? How do we live this radical, absolutely radical, upside down, crazy love that Jesus had? How do you die on a cross for that person that's different from you? That's the question they're asking. They're not asking anywhere in the New Testament, how can I get to heaven? They're asking, how do I live out this radical thing of Jesus? This new life that's it's going to continue forever, you know. But how do I live it out today? Paul saw that and did that. And it's just, man, the elders will recognize this. I told the elders about a book to read that just, man, we ought to read this. And it's really challenging book. And I showed it to Mom Monday, and Monday night she read the introductory in the first chapter of it. And then Tuesday morning she gave it back to me and said, this is really making me uncomfortable. This is really hard. I said, yeah, doesn't it? Doesn't it just jerk you around a little bit? But yeah, I mean, plowing through it and continuing to read through it. But Paul's talking about things that are bumping up against the people, you know, bumping up against us in hard ways. And a lot of Romans 9 through 11, there's so much here about God that is the hard stuff about God, you know. Yeah, I raised up Pharaoh to be someone that I could judge, someone that I could go and show my power. He said that in Romans 9 through 11. And man, we want to have a reason for that and explain. Paul never offers a reason. Okay, but he's about to get to a very important statement about it here in just a second as he goes through here. Let's go verse 25. He says, so that you may not claim to be wiser than you are. So whatever is in this paragraph is so that we'll just check ourselves a little bit and not claim to know it all. He just said, here's the purpose of my paragraph, so that you will not claim to be wiser than you are. Let me say this, brothers and sisters. I want you to understand this mystery. A hardening has come upon the part of Israel until the full number of Gentiles has come in. And all Israel will be saved. Now, we'll come back to that sentence in a minute, because that sentence has caused a lot of problems throughout the centuries. You remember, I've talked about before, and others have talked about before, you put the Bible down and you stack 2,000 years of writing and thinking on top of it, you know. And what we really need to do is go back down here and get this. So this is one of those places, there's been a ton of stuff. All Israel will be saved, okay? As it is written, out of Zion will come to deliver, but will banish the ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake. Remember, he's still talking to the Gentiles. As regards the gospel, they, the Jews, are enemies of God for your sake. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their ancestors. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. But just as you were once obedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, so they now have been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they too may now receive mercy. And then comes the sentence, just like Romans 3:23. We don't know this one as well, but remember in Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory. His conclusion is, they've sinned, everybody's sinned. Okay? And he says the same thing here. For God has imprisoned all in disobedience, so that he might be merciful to all. So in Romans 3:23, the object of the sentence is it kind of comes from we have sinned. And then from this viewpoint, God has imprisoned. God has given over the world to sin, everyone to sin, and sin as a power, so that he may be his mercy can be shown to all. Okay? And then his conclusion, and we'll go back and talk about all Israel will be saved. What is his response to what he just said? Oh, the depth and the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable are his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Jeremiah 15:8. Who has been his counselor? Isaiah 40:13. Who has given a gift to him to receive a gift in return? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. He breaks out in worship and says, I don't even know what to say. How deep God is, and how wide God is, and how his ways are. God says your ways are not like my ways. Okay? Your ways are not like my ways. And so Paul talks here, but also admits, I don't know completely what I'm saying. God's too big for me to completely grasp all this. But what I know is that everybody's in sin and that everybody has been shown mercy, and no one is outside of the mercy of God. No one is outside. And no one is outside of judgment being what is due to them. No one is outside of that. Everybody here is the same. And everybody out there is the same. And he says, I can't grasp it all. I can't get my mind all around. I'm sorry? Oh, yes. And that's what he does. He worships here. He can't help but take a few verses here to go, man, to him be glory forever and ever and ever. Amen, he says, and he can't help but worship and be thankful to God. For from him, through him, to him are all things. From him, through him, to us. And to him are all things. And so to him be the glory forever and ever. That's his response to all this. Now, all Israel will be saved. Obviously, there's two ways to read that, right? Israel as a Jewish nation, as the children of Abraham, as the physical descendants of Abraham, all Israel will be saved. And then what's the other way to read that? The kingdom. Okay? All right. Let's go back. I got to look and see where it is. 9:32 and 33. Go back to 9:32. I think this is a clue to what he's saying here. That may not be what I'm looking for. Nine 6. I'm sorry. I'm 9:6. It is not as though the word of God had failed. This is at the beginning of this. For not all Israelites truly belong to Israel. I think this is a clue to that. Okay? And when you're talking about the tree, and when he talks to the Gentiles about the tree and the root, they have been grafted in to Israel. To Israel. And so I believe, just from that basic statement that he says up front at the beginning, that there are Israelites who are not Israel. There are Israelites who have been cut off. And he says they may come back. They may come back. But that would imply they may not come back. And if they haven't come back, they're dead branches laying on the ground or have been burned in the fire, so to speak, or whatever. And so when you take the whole thing, I think we are spiritual Israel. Okay? We are spiritual Israel. That was one thing that Christianity failed to do throughout the millennia. was to realize the blessing, the love, the God that came to us through Israel, and to celebrate that. For the most part, Israel has been persecuted throughout the millennia. You know, Hitler's rationale, when you read Hitler's writings, one of his rationale for the Jews being destroyed was that they had killed Jesus. They needed to be punished for it. You know, and so that has happened. Martin Luther, man, when you read Martin Luther, who one of the great Christian writers, he had a period of life where he was not happy with the Jews. I mean, he hated them and said they all need to be murdered and killed. And so all throughout history that has happened. And one of the great failures of Christianity is not heeding what Paul says here in Romans 9 through 11. We have a great heritage that came through the promises God made to the Jewish people. We had a great heritage. And we haven't understood the Jewishness enough of our faith. And I think one of the things that we do when we go down and grab the Bible again out from under all that, and we blow the dust off of it and we look at it, is we're going to understand it more fully when we read it through the Jewish story. You know, when we hear the Jewish story and the Jewish language of what God was doing, because we are them. We're them. And I mentioned last week, man, there's so many Jews coming to Christ now. You know, that we live in a time and an age when it's so wonderful. And like I said, if you ever get a chance to go visit a Messianic church, go visit a Messianic church. You know, Jews who love Jesus and celebrate the Messiah has come. We have so much to learn from people, from the Jewish people. But chapter 12, and we could spend a lot more time on that. Chapter 12. Last section of Romans, Paul kind of stops and, you know, maybe in the room, remember it, maybe in our pretend room where the Jews are sitting over here and the Gentiles are sitting over there on this side of the room. Maybe, you know, there's been some hands raised and, you know, to him be the glory forever. Amen, amen, amen. Maybe because Paul's just kind of stopped in worship for a minute. Maybe, I like to think, maybe there's starting to be a couple of Gentiles that walked over here and moved, you know what I'm saying? I'm just making up this story, but you know what I'm saying? That a couple of Gentiles now have walked over here, sat on this side and put their arm around a Jew. You know, maybe there's some people over here thinking, maybe there's a few people still over here, and maybe there was I hate those people still, but I still hate them. I still can't stand them, you know. Maybe there's starting to be some coming together. And then we come to chapter 12. And he says this is where it all hits the fan. This is where we live it. So what? He's just presented the gospel, and the gospel produced a timeout to say we got to talk about this Jew thing. We got to talk about it. Okay, but it just produced a time out, and he says, time in. Don't forget where we were. Don't forget where we are. And this is the part. So what do we do? So what? What do we do? Because of the righteous shall live by faith, and the righteous include everyone, and those who live by faith includes everyone. Jesus has died for everyone. He says, so, therefore, okay, as we begin chapter 1, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. He takes us all the way back to Genesis and Adam and Eve's vocation. Adam and Eve's vocation were to be royal priests. They were to do the priestly work of working and keeping the garden. And that included being fruitful, multiplying, not just multiplying babies, multiplying this world, spreading this world out from where it was, subduing the chaos, keeping the chaos at bay. And the way you keep chaos at bay in Genesis is you eat only from the tree of life, and you do not grab your own fruit tree to eat from, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's how you subdue. That anytime you run into a situation, if you're Adam and Eve, and I'm not sure what to do, what do? I need help. What do I do here? My only source of help in life. I need you to tell me what to do. So when a serpent slithers up and says, did God say you could eat, that you couldn't eat from that tree? What were they supposed to do? I need your help with this. Hey, I need you to tell me what to do here. Hey, but they continued to allow a journey to, okay, I've got a big choice here to make, and it sounds pretty good over here. It even sounds better than this way, And that's the picture that's being painted in the Garden of Eden. And so Paul has already used this language in Romans 6. Remember, he said, offer your members as instruments. Okay? He said that a couple of times in chapter 6, when he's talking about baptism, when he's talking about we've died, we've been raised. What do we do now we've been raised? You offer the members of your body as instruments of holiness, as instruments of worship. Your mind, your thought, your eyes, your hands, every part of your body becomes an instrument of worship. He says, same thing he's doing here, except he just says you offer your whole, you put your whole self in, you put your whole, instead of just put your right hand in, he says you put your whole self in and do the hokey pokey. And he says, this is your spiritual act of worship. Now, he follows a little logic here, and I'm going to stop here tonight, but let's follow this real quick, and then we'll talk about it next week, okay? So he says, offer your bodies first. He says, this is your worship. You are, as a royal priest, you offer your whole self in. Okay? And by the way, just to mention again, and I've got it in your notes here, in Genesis 2:15 it says, work it and keep it. He put him in the garden and said, work it and keep it. Okay? He tells the priest in Leviticus and Numbers, when they go to the tabernacle, work it and keep it. Same language, same Hebrew words. So the priests are doing in the tabernacle what the humanity is supposed to be doing. We're living as royal priests. So then he says in the next verse, he says, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed. Well, Paul, how do we happen? He says it begins where? Renewing the mind. So when you offer your body in worship, when you offer your entire self in worship, it begins, Mark's preached this. He's been preaching this to us. It begins here. Our thinking changes first. And now, is that a magical, I think I'm going to renew my mind and transform my mind. I'm going to work on that this week. And by Friday, I think it'll be done. That is not what happens. That is not what happens. I'm learning in my life that it takes a lifetime to change things sometimes. And it takes generations to change things. It takes, it's the nature of the depth of humanity's depth in sin and depth in creating our own ways to think, and me creating my own ways of thinking. And but he says, be transformed by the renewing of your minds. And he says there's a positive thing about that, right? He says, be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that, okay, you're going to be able to do something if you renew your minds. What are you going to be able to do? discern what the will of God is. You're going to know what the will of God is. When he gives you his mind, and Paul says this again in 1 Corinthians, by the way, in one of the most amazing passages in the whole New Testament. He says, no one knows the thoughts of a person except the person inside. No one knows the thoughts of God except God. We have not been given a spirit from the world. We have been given the Spirit of God. What did he just say? We can know what God thinks. That's what we have the power to do. We have the power to know what God thinks. And he says it here too. He says, renew your mind so that you, and it's transforming, he says in this sentence. It'll completely transform everything when your mind is renewed and you can think like God and you can know exactly what God would do at this moment and that moment. You're eating from the tree of life. You're getting sustenance from the tree of life. You may discern what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable. Okay? Somebody raises their hand. Paul, question. Talk about renewing your mind. Okay, what does he do in the next verse? He says, do not think. He's still talking about the mind. There's a progression here, okay? He says, by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. That's the renewing of the mind. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. But think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. Well, Paul, what does that look like? For as one body we have many members, and not all members have the same functions. So we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually we are members of one another. We have different gifts. He says, so here's the definition of not thinking of yourself more highly than you ought to. The definition of renewing your mind is don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to. The definition of not thinking of yourself more highly than you ought to is you're a part of something greater. You're one part of something bigger. That's the definition of not thinking of yourself more highly than you ought to. I'm just a part, which means, man, there's a couple of implications there. I have to be a part. Here's the argument against our culture's view that we don't need the church, get rid of it. I'm going to worship, me and God are going to go up to the mountains this weekend, and that's me and God. That's all we're going to do. Paul would say, that's good. I find some good stuff there. But man, where this is lived is right here between me and Betty. And God says, I want to create a situation that something can't be accomplished unless Tommy puts in a part and Betty puts in a part and Mark puts in a part and Ada puts in a part. And Mark can't put in Ada's part. I'm not going to give Mark Ada's part. That's what God's trying to accomplish in this world. So it's not just thinking of ourselves, we have to participate in a way that, oh man, and I will tell you, that's a fight that I struggle with. I'm confessional right now. Everything in me when I wake up in the morning wants to run off by myself into the mountains and to an island somewhere. And that is as against what Paul is saying here as anything. That we're supposed to accomplish something that only every one of us can put our piece in. Okay? If it's David putting all his pieces in and doing that as much as David can do, then to David be the glory forever and ever. Amen, right? If David does it all. Okay? But Paul is saying, here's the kind of thinking that is working and keeping the garden, that is priestly work, that you're throwing your life in and you're throwing your lot in with everybody here because Wayne's going to have a part to play and you're going to put your part in, and what you are going to build from all the parts is going to be what people can go, God is awesome. That's what offering your bodies as living sacrifices, beginning with the mind, Don't think of yourself more highly. And so what does thinking of yourself more highly look like? Man, I ain't doing it with those people. Hey, and what does Paul have in mind here? He has in mind the Jewish part and the Gentile part and all these things coming together, all these things happening. To be something that only God has done. The only person that can reverse Babel is who? The God who created Babel is the only one that can reverse Babel. And we are participants in that, Paul says. Then what he's going to do, and what we're going to talk about next week, is, so how does that look? What are the practical ways that looks every day? What does it look like? Questions, comments? The implications of this paragraph right here go against every American rugged individualism gene that is in our bodies. Okay? Yeah. 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 And I'm beginning. I've had a tendency through my life and ministry to do things that I could accomplish. And man, I will tell you, I've had my fair share of pats on the back over the years. Okay? And I've also had my fair share of, probably more of a fair share of people who privately or publicly have said, idiot, And that's, over time, that's diminished on how much I care about that. Still there's some, but what I'm realizing, a biblical spiritual worldview is something different than that. And I find myself growing in a hunger to accomplish something that we do together. I want to see, I want to see what happens when we all do something that we couldn't do without your part and my part and Sue's part and the tiller's part, Yeah, that man, our lots, we're thrown in our lots together, We're tossing in our lots together to God. And so that's what offering our bodies as a living sacrifice means, is that we're a part of something that only God can get the glory and we'll get the glory, that we all have to be a part of and we all need each other, I've said before, and I'll end with this, that I don't really care. I think that if you put about 100 people like us in the same building once a week, and we tossed in some of our resources together, we can do some pretty good things. A lot more certainly than any one of us could do. But that doesn't mean, what we could do is get, that's what 100 people can accomplish when they put some of their resources together, But what would God accomplish if we put our whole lives in together? What would God accomplish in this neighborhood, in this town, in this community, in this world? If we went all cross in, and so that's what Paul's getting after here. Before he tells them, okay, here's the practical thing, don't worry. What he's going to get to and where he's going to arrive is, hey, let's not worry so much about what we're eating. That's as practical as it gets, the food we're eating. But notice where he begins. He begins with this big giant picture. He doesn't start chapter 12 with saying, hey, let's talk about kosher food for a minute. That's not where he starts practically. He starts by painting this beautiful picture of royal priests being all in, thinking of themselves in the correct and right way when you compare yourself to God, and then realizing that we're all in this together. And what we're a part of is reversing Babel. and in a sense building a tower to God, you know, but it's a human temple. It's a human thing. So, any thoughts, comments, questions? Yeah, big tall task, big tall order. We keep climbing down off the altar. Yeah. And you know that's the other point that I didn't make tonight. That there's also an aspect of this. You're the priest, but you're also the sacrifice. You're also, you know, in this. And that's a big, huge picture and part of this too. Yeah. Ooh, God help us. God help us. Y'all have a blessed week. Thank you for being here. We'll continue on. And next week, look more. Paul's going to keep telling us, keep going narrower and narrower and telling us, okay, so this is what this looks like. This is what people who use their gifts together look like. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good, love each other, accept those who are weak. Accept, you know, he's going to make a lot of statements in chapter 12. So anyway, okay. Thank you. Hey, Betty, we're going to meet tomorrow.